Hi, this is Greg Levine, and this is the party line for August 26, 2011. And I want to talk this week about a piece written by Dianne Feinstein that I saw yesterday afternoon on Huffington Post. It specifically addresses the idea that we need to learn some lessons from this week's earthquake that was centered in Mineral, Virginia. Lessons specific to America's nuclear safety. Senator Feinstein makes some assertions that I quibble with a bit. Some of her lessons are perhaps a little redundant or need a little more explanation. I go on at greater length in the post, so please take a look. But let's focus on a couple of things. First off, that Dianne Feinstein says very specifically that the country needs a comprehensive plan for dealing with spent fuel. And you know what? I can't agree more. We need a comprehensive plan for dealing with spent fuel. Most specifically, Senator Feinstein talks about the need to move a lot of our spent fuel from these liquid pools, where most of it is now harbored, to something called dry casks. The difference being dry casks are much more stable. Liquid pools require a circulating cooling system. It's usually water. You've seen big problems with these pools in the Fukushima Daiichi reactors, where they were stored near the reactors themselves. They suffered damage in the earthquake and in the tsunami. Water levels got too low, or the cooling systems were damaged, and you're seeing reactions that have caused hydrogen explosions, actually, in some of these pools. And they're casting off large amounts of radioactive material like iodine and cesium. Similar situations exist in many of America's nuclear plants, and interestingly, Dianne Feinstein specifically refers to the NRC's Special Task Force report, the one that I've addressed a couple of times, the report that was designed to make changes to the American nuclear safety regime based on lessons we'd learned at Fukushima, the report that is being slow-walked mostly by both nuclear regulatory commissioners and members of the House and Senate. She refers to that report as teaching us that we need to move our fuel from these liquid pools, at least first to dry casks, noting that dry casks in Japan did not suffer the same fate as the liquid pools, and then eventually to a major off-site repository. But here's what's really wild. As I talked about at the time, there is nothing in the task force report that specifically says anything about dry casks or a comprehensive policy to deal with spent fuel. It's not in there. It was one of the most glaring omissions. It was something that the Physicians for Social Responsibility, for instance, highlighted when they basically gave faint praise to the task force report. But Feinstein says this is an important thing and it needs to be dealt with, and in the report or not, it really does. The other point that Feinstein makes is that we need to seriously reevaluate our seismic and flood safety protocols for nuclear plants. She specifically says that we need our efforts today to protect against seismic problems are probably not sufficient, or they may not be sufficient. I take out the modifiers again. I think they're very clearly not sufficient, and for several reasons, very few of which are addressed specifically by Feinstein, but several of which I and others have been wrestling with in recent months. Specifically, there is the issue of how we evaluate the seismic safety of nuclear facilities in the United States, how we evaluate both the integrity, the ability of a core to stand up to a seismic event, but also how the rest of the systems required to keep a nuclear plant safe would react in an earthquake. And there's been some debate back and forth about whether or not when the Nuclear Regulatory Commission initially licensed these plants, and when they are supposedly re-examining them now, and some have been, others are waiting to be re-examined since the earthquake in Japan, whether they are evaluating the core, the containment vessel, or also the cooling systems and the backup power generators and the spent fuel pools and the cooling system for that and the electricity needed to monitor all of these things. And I think getting closer as we go to an answer to this question. It's not a particularly satisfying answer. I have discovered frankly just stumbled upon a Congressional Research Service report from May that talks about a change in the way we evaluate or rate a plant for seismic safety. Back when our plants were licensed, and remember, all of the plants in the United States are now basically a generation old. They're the last of them built in the 80s. Back when we were licensing, we used a certain kind of protocol which was called the determinative seismic. Let me just make sure I've got this right. That's right. The deterministic seismic hazard analysis, the DSHA. That's how we evaluated whether, how strong the plant should be, to what Richter scale level, or actually they usually talk about vibration level, the plant needed to be built to what spec. But we've discovered since then that something called the probabilistic seismic hazard analysis, the PSHA, is actually a better way of looking at things. I can't get into the details of which is which. I provide a link to the whole report. It explains it in much greater detail. But suffice it to say that the P is better than the D. The new system is better than the old system, but everything that was built was evaluated in the old system. The thing is that now we've got plants applying for renewals of licenses, plants that were never intended to be in operation this long, asking to have their licenses renewed. We have other plants that are asking to build additional reactors at the sites that were reviewed under the old standard. And the question is, how is the NRC evaluating these requests? And indeed, in their seismic review that's occurring right now, what are they using to evaluate the requests? As best I can tell, the seismic review is using the P standard, but they're using the P standard, the probabilistic standard, to evaluate the core. But there's absolutely no mention that they are using it to evaluate any of the other systems, the myriad systems that are required to keep the entire facility safe, or to keep people safe from the entire facility. And I think when I don't see it spelled out specifically, my tendency is to believe that they are not, doing the full P Monty here. That we are basically assuming that previous reviews under the old standard are good enough in most of the other cases. There's just, from all the evidence we've had from the reports about the collusion between the NRC and the industry, the tendency is that you've got to assume that the minimum will be done by the industry, and that regulation is probably pursuing something towards the minimum as well. So quite possibly, and yet I'm still trying to narrow this down, the reviews of seismic vulnerability of plants might be under the new probability standard, but that does not take into account, say, the integrity of the cooling system for the spent fuel pools. I feel pretty confident in saying that. And it's not just me. There are actually others, including language in one of the NRC's own reports that says something very similar. So that we definitely have a problem where we don't have a comprehensive, full, new standard review of everything it takes to keep a nuclear facility safe. That sort of thing is something that is addressed in the NRC's task force report. It basically says we have a patchwork and we need a comprehensive single standard. Will we get a comprehensive single standard? Probably not. I mean, not anytime soon. The standard, some of the rules will be evaluated in the next 45 days, but the overall sort of overarching way in which we evaluate nuclear plants could take another 18 months before we have any kind of rules issued by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That's a long way away, especially when you consider that once those rules are issued, they will again be slow-walked. The implementation of them will be slow-walked again. So it's actually up to I don't know, government to hold people accountable. Crazy, right? I mean, I'm talking to you today on the day that Japan's Prime Minister Naoto Kan actually had to resign. Maybe he had to resign because his popularity has fallen below 20%, because he has not done enough to assure his public that he is doing all he can to end the crisis at the Fukushima plant, that basically the populace has turned very much anti-nuclear, wants to see nuclear power phased out, has felt honestly and properly that they've been lied to throughout this process, and that much more has gone wrong, and they've been exposed to much more radiation during this crisis, to the point where the Prime Minister, in an effort to at least, if not save his skin, I don't know, prolong his term a little bit, vowed to tilt the country away from nuclear power and towards renewables completely. Which leads to the other possibility, which is that the Prime Minister felt he had to step down right now because other members of his party, who are still beholden to Japan's nuclear industry, felt like he was no longer in their corner. And they needed a guy who was going to go to bat for the entrenched powers that are the nuclear industry in Japan, which is very, very well connected inside the Japanese government. How will we answer which was which? Well, probably both have a little something to do with it, but, you know, the proof will be in the pudding. And that, in the end, which way Japan goes with its energy future will say a lot about who pulls the strings in the Japanese government. In the United States, we don't have such a stark choice, which goes a long way to telling us who pulls the strings here, sadly. We don't have a choice as far as our elected leaders who, for the most part, especially at the presidential level, have reassured the nuclear industry that we will full steam ahead with nuclear power and expansion of nuclear power in this country. But we do have a choice at each individual plant because, you know, as ugly as the politics are, the chance of a disaster, what would happen in a nuclear disaster, is uglier. So, you live in a community, you have local officials who have some say over what happens with that nuclear plant. And that's probably where you have the best chance at leverage in this system. Yes, Senator Barbara Boxer says she'll have hearings again on the NRC recommendations, but that is the tiniest tip of the kind of the wrong iceberg, because eventually we've got to get rid of these old nuclear plants. They are expensive and counterproductive and dangerous. And to do that, I think we're going to have to battle them one by one. We can't really count on a national policy, right now anyway. And that's the party line. See you next week.